But relative to the U.S. and China, and I guess I think about something that was in the news in the last week where one of Anthropic's applications escaped onto the internet and attacked enterprise software. Now, think about what happens if China has an AI application that doesn't escape, but is allowed to lie quietly in wait and is used to attack software that would otherwise be used to support Patriot missiles, to provide for the defense of missiles that are coming at the U.S., whether from North Korea, Russia, China, or even Cuba, right? Or drones. So if China can create software that can neutralize our software capabilities to defend ourselves, it's game over, right? And you don't want that to happen. And that's the arms race today, in my opinion.
Hi, this is Matt Slepin, and welcome to Leading Voices in Real Estate. Today's episode, recorded on August 5th, is a conversation with Bill Stein, former CEO of Digital Realty Trust, currently a partner in Primary Digital Infrastructure, board members of other various data center businesses, including Crusoe, and a board member of Host, the hospitality REIT. In today's conversation, Bill provides background, context, opinions, and overall wisdom on data centers, which all of a sudden has become probably the hottest topic in our national discourse, and maybe around the world, since data centers have become the literal concrete proxy for our discomforts around tech and AI, our discomfort around the billions being spent and the billionaires committing those resources. Local opinion can maybe stop a data center, but we don't know how or if we want to stop AI, which is too emotional, too nuanced, and too conflicted. It's fascinating stuff. So the data center becomes the place of battle to slow things down. Bill and I go way back. My wife Diane literally took over Bill's office in San Francisco when iStar, or then Starwood Financial, did a reverse merger with his company TriNet back in 1999. And we were friends when he then joined pre-IPO Digital Realty as its CFO and CIO, and then its CEO. And we had regular over-breakfast discussions about this then emerging data center business. So I had a front row seat to follow the evolution of the data center world way before it became front page news through these conversations with Bill. Bill left Digital in 2022, the same year that ChatGPT blew our minds and the AI arms race really began. That was just 4 years ago. Fast forward into the AI arms race, which is both between the half dozen U.S. names and firms that we all know, and also at a very different and very existential level between the U.S. and China. And this arms race requires new gigundo AI learning data centers to be built which present the normal NIMBY backlash, but they also suck huge amounts of energy and can currently represent very real existential opportunities and very real existential threats. This is not D and R stuff, actually, but it also comes during a time of societal and political discomfort. Lots going on here. My podcast feed is full of data center explorations. My news feed the same, and the conflated AI and data center discussion hits dinner table conversations everywhere. As I mentioned to Bill, I visited with my best friend from college a few weeks ago and told him that I expect that a primary role of philosophers, government, priests, rabbis, teachers, and shrinks over the next decade will be to help us navigate this stuff. We kind of had a shouting match with him saying, "Game over, there's no turning back," and me saying, "Our job is to find ways to deal with this stuff." That back and forth is happening everywhere as we all wonder who and what we will become. Who knows? And is it an equal bet, or a 75-25, or a 25-75 on dystopian apocalypse versus utopian future, or both at the same time? And data centers will enable this wherever it goes. So this is a noisy topic, and I turn back to Bill to walk me and our listeners through the different threads of this debate with the backdrop of some history of the evolution of this business, back when he took Digital through its IPO when the markets were skeptical that data centers might be a relevant business. Lots of ground covered in the conversation, and I hope that you find the orientation that this discussion brings as helpful as I did. With data centers as a huge growth sector, of course, the human capital needs of that industry, from business leaders to construction workers, is enormous. and ZRG in its various lines of business, from interim placement to embedded recruiting, where we can help companies staff up huge immediate team requirements at all levels, to executive search. CRG is here to help. August is Climate Month on Leading Voices, and the two choices this August are different than our past discussions. The last episode with Mike McNamara talked about factory-built ADUs as a small-scale, bottoms-up approach to the housing crisis, and this conversation with Bill focuses on what might be the biggest climate challenge that we have, which is the enormous expansion of energy use to fuel the AI arms race. Different than past year's discussions, but both quite relevant to the climate question and the built environment. I encourage you to share these episodes with your colleagues. You can find the archive, including the earlier conversation with Bill and my discussion with John Lynn from Equinix 2 years ago, on the ZRG website or your favorite podcast app. If ZRG could be helpful on the human capital side in your real estate enterprise, including executive search, interim search, coaching, or business consulting, we'd love to talk. Feel free to reach out to me at mslepin@grgpartners.com. I hope that you enjoy this conversation with my friend Bill Stein. Bill Stein, welcome back to Leading Voices in Real Estate, and really good to see you in your hotel room in Philly. For context, you were on Leading Voices early on in the show back in 2019, before the word data center had a lot of resonance in popular culture, different today. And it was also well before chat came out in 2022, I think is really the gating time of when all of this really quickened in the consciousness. You were with Digital Realty, which was the largest data center REIT and the largest data center player in the industry. And I want to know where it is today. Since then, I had John Lynn from Equinix on the podcast, and that's about 2 years ago. And 2 years is a lifetime in this business. Yesterday, I woke up on my hike and I listened to an Ezra Klein podcast all about the data center industry. And then before I went to bed, I was scrolling through, and in the Atlantic, here was the headline of the news last night before bed. The last thing I got to think about, it said, opposition to data centers may be the singular unifying issue in American politics. 70% of Americans are against data center construction in their communities. NIMBYism to its best. So as that is a little bit of background, maybe we'll talk about that, but I want to understand what this business is, and history is going to matter a lot to get us to the present place. And then you can help us unpack what the present place means about data center, AI, how they're connected, and what the noise is about and where it might be going. So I think that's our conversation, and it's probably half real estate and half philosophy, so we're going to get into each. Bill, welcome to Leading Voices.
Hey, Matt, thanks for having me. Good to be back. Good to see you again.
Yes. So maybe introduce yourself. Tell us what you're doing today, where you are, what's going on, and then we'll kind of go through the history and then think about lots of stuff.
Sure. I'm Bill Stein. I did spend 18 years in the data center industry. I started actually with GI Partners in early 2004, which was the predecessor to Digital. We took Digital public in November of 2004, and I was with Digital until the end of 2022. The first 10 years or so as Chief Financial Officer and Chief Investment Officer, the last 8 years as Chief Executive Officer. Today, I am one of the 4 founders of Primary Digital Infrastructure. I serve as its Chief Investment Officer. PDI is in the investment and advisory world for digital infrastructure. The deal that we're best known for is the Abilene Stargate project, where Crusoe is the developer and Blue Owl provided the capital. And that was a significant deal where we really brought Blue Owl capital to the table to provide the funding for that. And we actually had to work on renegotiating the lease with Oracle and work on some of the construction contracts to make the whole package financeable, because it was project financing in the truest sense. In addition to being one of the founders of PDI, I continue to serve on the board of Host Hotels and Resorts. I joined the Host board in, probably 2015, 16, something like that. Jim Rosolio is a longtime friend, the CEO. I'm also chairman of the compensation committee there and on the audit committee. I'm in Philadelphia, as you noted today, because I'm on the board of Salute, which is in the data center services business. It's a company that's majority owned by New Mountain Capital out of New York. I also am chairman of a company called Verne Global, which is a European data center company with a focus primarily on the Nordics, with also an investment in outside of Paris in France. Ardian is the majority and sole owner of Verne. Ardian is a French private equity firm that is really the largest infrastructure investor in Europe. I'm also on the board of Crusoe AI. I had been on the advisory board of Crusoe, and I joined their board in May of this year. And Crusoe is an extremely active new player in the data center world, but growing incredibly rapidly. And finally, I serve as an advisor to Blue Owl Digital Infrastructure, and I also serve as an operating partner to Ardian, the French private equity firm. I think that's the end of it. There may be a few things I've forgotten, but that may be it. So that's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm doing now. It's been a busy ride after Digital Realty.
I bet it has, and one that you could not. When you left digital in 2022, chat had come out. Did you foresee the gold rush or the arms race that was about to happen when you left? Was this imaginable at that point in time? And that's only a few years ago.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I kind of stepped into it almost immediately with my engagement with Crusoe, because they were, shortly after that, they were working on the Abilene site. And that's an interesting one because phase one was 200 plus megawatts. I think it was 206. And it seemed like a big deal to us at the time. It was $3.5 billion. It was a great first deal, leased to Oracle on a triple net basis. Then phase two came along, and that was another 600 plus megawatts, I think 636. Again, triple net leased to Oracle. And I think that one was around 12 billion. So we went from 3 to 12, which was huge, right?
Some numbers, yeah.
And then it was either 9 or 12. I'm actually forgetting now. But then phase three came. And phase three is a 900 megawatt deal. 900 megawatts. And that one's leased to Microsoft. And that one's 15 billion, roughly. So, these numbers are astonishing. And in the case of Oracle, that's a learning model application. So it could be in Abilene, Texas. Latency was not as important. What was more important was to have power. And initially there was what they call behind the meter power, which means that there's plenty of gas in that part of Texas.
I think so.
And gas is what was used to fire up the electrical generators. There's also grid power available. Sort of grid power can lag, so you can use the gas-fired gens as a bridge to grid power. But now gas is in that location and many others, gas-fired generation is sort of the primary means to generate electricity because the grid in general for data centers, because there's just not enough power on the grid. So when locating data centers today, it's important to find areas of the country where there is excess energy available, whether it's grid power in some cases, which you can actually find in the old part of the world that I used to inhabit, Pittsburgh, in Western Pennsylvania, the upper Midwest, the former Steel Belt has underutilized electrical generation, and in parts of the country where there's gas in the ground and gas pipelines.
So you said a bunch of words here. I want to highlight those words, come back to them, but then I want to go through a little bit of history in terms of to think about how this industry has evolved from when you were there, which was really at the beginning. But you talked about what's going on in Abilene, at least one or two of these phases as a learning model application, so that's word one. Word two is that doesn't have a latency issue. So that's word number two. Then we talked about power as word number three. And actually, we're fitting this podcast into my month of August programming on Leading Voices, because every August has been Climate Month on Leading Voices, because we talk about the relationship between real estate, climate change, and energy. And in the case of data centers, that's one of the headline issues is, what are we going to do about energy? Because the energy suck really matters here, and so does carbon. So help just think about, for a moment, learning model application, latency, power. We haven't talked about water, but kind of just use those words a little bit.
Okay. So in general, in AI, there are two buckets or two categories of application. Initially, there's the learning model, which is a really compute-intensive application where the software basically teaches itself to get better. It's a self-learning model. And inference is where you use that model, the model that is constantly getting better, to serve the needs of its clients. So those could be enterprise customers. Those could be government customers predominantly. Those could be consumers. When you go and chat GPT and ask it to do something, you're using AI.
You said
Same with
inference
Claude.
is the second word?
Inference is the second word. If you use Claude to create a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint presentation based on the data you feed into Claude, that's an inference application. So those are the two broad buckets. And so connectivity is the same as latency, and that's the ability for the data to move quickly from one point to another. But you don't really need latency when you're trying to improve the model in the first instance.
So I had this fear some time ago. Again, I'm really sensitive to climate questions, right? So every time I would use chat, I was like, oh my God, I'm cutting down a forest of trees for energy here. But really the heavy energy use is in the learning period of time. That's what's the heaviest. And the query that I make isn't sucking a lot of energy. Is that true?
I mean, it is true. I think the query, though, does take more energy than when you used to go on Google and do a search.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but
it uses more energy if you write it than sending an email. A lot more energy.
And the stuff in Abilene, which has 200 megawatts, 600 megawatts, 900, that's the very energy intensive and the learning model, not the inference uses of this stuff. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's certainly true for Oracle. I can't speak for Microsoft.
Okay, fair deal. And so let's go back, and I want to think of a little bit of history, because you were in the data center business back when, and back before AI and before that heavy use, and even maybe before the cloud. So I want to just play this out a little bit, and also before the history that you have, you understood energy. So let's just kind of walk through your career in the next 5 minutes, but it's really interesting as background for this, because I think you started maybe at Westinghouse. What's the understanding what energy is about?
Well, I actually started out as a lawyer, okay, and as a litigator doing jury trials, insurance defense work. That was 3 years. It's good experience for going into the corporate world, but not something I really wanted to do for the rest of my life. My first corporate job was with Duquesne Light, the electric utility in Pittsburgh, and I joined their legal team as a deal lawyer, securities and finance lawyer, compliance lawyer, and worked with the chief financial officer, a wonderful guy by the name of Wes Von Schack, who became the CEO. And when he became the CEO, he asked me to join the finance team, first as assistant treasurer and then treasurer. So that was my exposure in the utility business. But as a lawyer, I did a lot of work on nuclear fuel financings, working with the NRC, because Duquesne was a big owner. Actually, Duquesne was the first owner of a nuclear power plant, Shippingport Atomic Power Station. So I was exposed to nuclear there, and they had a lot of coal as well, as you might imagine, being in Western Pennsylvania. I moved from Duquesne Light to Westinghouse, and initially Westinghouse Credit, the financial services side, and then over to Westinghouse Electric. And so I spent, I think, 6 or 7 years with Westinghouse. And then I guess I went out to San Francisco, which is maybe where we ran into each other for the first time. I went to work for a company called TriNet, which was in the triple net lease business. When they took it public, I think it was in, when was that? 94, maybe? 93, 94?
It's probably in the early stage of the modern REIT world. They were an early REIT, I'm guessing.
They were an early REIT, and it was basically the public equity was a lifeline, because this was a follow-on to the S&L crisis. And a lot of these companies had too much debt, not enough equity. So they raised, like many of the early REITs, they raised public equity to recap themselves. So TriNet went public, and they knew me from my work at Westinghouse, and they asked me to join as the chief financial officer, and eventually became the president of TriNet. We sold that business in 1999 to a company that at the time was called Starwood Financial. The chairman was Barry Sternlicht. The president was Jay Sugarman, and it eventually became iStar. So they renamed it actually at that time. I left the company on the sale. I was doing workouts.
Let's pause for a moment. Just important, because then my wife wound up opening the West Coast office for iStar and took over your office space. So a small world, and we talked about that a lot back in that day. So, but you left there, and then how did you get to GI?
I stayed in San Francisco and was doing workouts, working for private equity firms in the Valley. And one of the firms that I called on was GI Partners. Rick Madison, who ran GI Partners, was someone that I know when he was a banker at Merrill Lynch. And we'd stayed in touch. So I had breakfast with Rick, and I said, so here's what I'm doing. If you have any deals that need any attention, I'd be happy to help you out. He said, well, we don't have anything that needs that sort of attention in the portfolio, but I do have some assets that I'm thinking about taking public as REIT. They're predominantly data center assets. Is that something you'd like to help us with? And I said, sure, just call me when you're ready. And he did. So I think he called me in November of 2003, and we began discussions at that point. I came on board in March of 2004, still doing workouts, frankly, for a little while for my clients, but working with GI at that time to help them get the portfolio ready for an IPO. And it was a tough IPO. It actually was an IPO that almost didn't happen. I still remember, the price talk was $14 to $16, and it priced at 12. Cohen Steers hated it. They wouldn't buy it. A lot of the East Coast REIT mafia wouldn't buy it in New York and Boston. We sold the deal in Chicago and on the West Coast. The last 2 days, we sold the deal basically in San Francisco and LA. Franklin in San Mateo put in an order for 15% of the deal. A guy named Alex Peters, who is, should be in the Franklin Hall of Heroes based on the amount of money I'm sure he made on that deal. But
so wait, let's put a pin in this, or let's pause for a second on this one. Here you are, it's 2004, it's a data center REIT, it has trouble going public. Just think about that. And what was the status of the data center business? And I'm remembering we talked about this at the time, and it was a niche. It was not one of the food groups. Niches didn't matter in real estate as much then as it does today, at least in the REIT world. But you were making a bet on something. You didn't know what it would become. What did data centers mean then, and what was latency then? What was energy then? What was the dollar amount for these things? Who were the players? Just what was the technology? Because I want to contrast that with where we got to today, and I know there's phases in between.
First of all, GI had bought most of these assets on a distressed basis. So this was post.com. There were a lot of distressed credits in the buildings.
Right.
And they were probably buying 11, 12 caps and down to 10 caps, but very attractive caps. But the public REIT investors remembered the trouble. And so they didn't see many of them, at least on the East Coast, didn't see the opportunity. The ones on the West Coast understood the opportunity. They understood that these credits could only get better. And the opportunity at that point was twofold. But for the most part, this was post 9/11. So if you remember 9/11, a number of the firms in the World Trade Center had their data center operations next to their employees. And so those companies were crippled when those buildings fell, not just because they lost their talent, but because they lost their data. And that demonstrated the importance of having your data in a more remote and secure location.
And redundancy, right? Because you needed your data to be in two places at the same time and not on floppy disks anymore. So that was still floppies, or there were still disks versus in the cloud.
Redundancy is really important. So many of the large enterprises would have multiple locations to protect their data at that point. So, that was basically one of the business cases for digital early on. And it was an enterprise focus. The sales weren't that large, but what we were selling to banks, we were selling to oil companies. There were some government sales, not a lot of tech, a lot of telecommunications though, and some content, like the type of content that you'd watch on your, Netflix type of stuff.
Was Netflix digital then, or was Netflix still a disc that you got in the mail? I'm trying to put this in a point of time because I don't remember that.
I don't remember either, to be honest with you. Might have been still disc. But Google IPO'd the same year as digital.
Wow. Okay. So that helps.
Yeah. So Google, in fact, in 2004, Google was the largest IPO in the Bay Area and digital was the second largest.
Unbelievable.
And IPO was $240 million of equity raised. Kind of put it in perspective. Not much compared to SpaceX, right?
So it's tarred and feathered with the telecom bust and the dot-com bust, and we can't see through the fog of that. You're going to take a risk on this crazy thing. You're not really seeing through the fog, but what the heck? Or maybe you're seeing through the fog.
I know it. We could see the opportunity. And then, shortly after that, the cloud came.
Okay. Talk about that.
And so from selling 100 kW, 200 or 300 kW racks to all of a sudden doing 1 meg deals with, 1 megs with options for another 1 or 2 megs. Those were like ring the bell type deals when we got those. That was probably 2007, 2008. IBM was a huge cloud customer for Digital. It started because of SoftLayer, which was acquired by IBM. And so we had those types of deals, Microsoft being another one of them. And that started to really accelerate the absorption. And then the cloud just took off from there. And by the way, all this talk about AI, the cloud business is still incredibly strong for these cloud providers. And you could probably saw it in the most recent second quarter results for Amazon and Microsoft. Their cloud businesses are humming. So don't overlook those cloud businesses.
So let's fast forward, and then we're going to come back to this because I'm curious about this. With all of the noise about data centers right now, is the hyper growth of data centers around these learning data centers where the cloud is teaching itself, or is it around inference, or how much is still the cloud? If I now have three buckets.
Well, it's all above. I think the hype, if you will, is around the learning applications because they're so big. Okay. But the cloud is steady Eddie at a very good, solid growth rate. And the inference, I think, is yet to come. I mean, there's certainly some inference, but more of that's going to come. And that's going to benefit the Equinix and Digitals of the world because they're the ones that have the highly connected facilities.
And what does that mean? So that brings us maybe back to the cloud. What do the Digitals and Equinixes do that is consistent with this, but they're not doing the learning part of it?
Well, Equinix in particular, Digital to a lesser extent, but still have invested in highly connected facilities. So where data is handed off. Interconnection facilities.
And does that mean latency? So it has to be close by. What do you mean by
latency? Like they're right next to each other. They're in these things called meeting rooms. They're immensely valuable. Equinix calls them IBXs. I don't know if Digital has quite as catchy a name, but it's the same principle. Digital owns a property in Chicago that they bought in 2005 called 350 East Cermak. It's basically the major interconnection point for the Midwest. Digital had 2323 Bryant Street in Dallas. That is one of the major interconnection points in the Southwest. They're in 60 Hudson Street, 32 Avenue of the Americas in New York. And those are the interconnection hubs.
What does interconnection mean? Interconnection means this is where the trunk lines
exactly.
Data
you can put stuff, it comes in and it goes out. And it can go anywhere in the world from there. And it can come in. Now, usually it comes in from somewhere close by, but then it can be distributed just about anywhere.
And so time, latency, location. I watched a movie, which you'll remember, The Butterfly Effect, and they gamed the system by adding or subtracting a split second, and that split second mattered, which probably wouldn't apply to Abilene, but would apply to these interconnected places that you're talking about.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's particularly important when you think about trading, right? Trading applications. So,
okay. So, and that's the old school of data center that you worked on at Digital before these learning centers, the Abilenes, these humongous places that suck the energy in the way that they do.
Yeah, I think the Digital and Equinix of the world, I hesitate to speak for both of them at this point, but I'm sure when they look at these learning centers, which tend to be in the middle of nowhere, there's concern about residual value. What happens at the end of the 15 to 20 year lease? What's that thing going to be worth? And fortunately, the leases are such as you can fully amortize the investment. And if you look at the amount of investment these tech companies have in these large learning centers, there's a high probability that they're going to stay or someone else is going to use it. But the Equinix and Digitals, didn't have to take that risk, if you will. And they had a portfolio with a very high embedded portfolio or high embedded value in these major metros and in the suburbs to the major metros, the core markets, if you will. And that's the bet they've made. It's a core market bet. And it's a core market bet on a global basis. So it's not just U.S. It's every major market in the world for those two companies.
And for those two companies, when we think about this, again, I'm remembering our conversations at breakfast over the years. It's not a real estate business as much as it is a technology business, and the skill set in those companies, knowing how to service those clients, has a lot to do with technology and being a partner to your clients versus here's space for you.
That's exactly right. I mean, the way you succeed, I think, it's not just for those two companies, but really any data center developer needs to partner with the hyperscaler. It's not the type of landlord-tenant relationship that you find in traditional real estate.
And
It's working
hyperscaler, does that fit both the cloud as well as it fits these learning centers? Is hyperscaler a word that fits in both words?
It does, yes.
Okay. So let's keep talking a little bit of history, and then I want to come back to the issue of residual value, obsolescence, and the risks and the chips that are being put on the table by these huge companies in these huge places, in, let's say, Abilene. But keep talking through the evolution while you were digital so that we can get to the present.
Well, the evolution of digital was that we added products. So we bought Telex, which was the second largest interconnection player in the U.S. to Equinix. So until we bought Telex, Equinix was a customer, remained a customer, but it was a complementary relationship. Once we bought Telex, it was pretty clear that we were on a collision course, and we started to compete for business. Then we bought DuPont Fabros, which DuPont Hussein, who was the CEO of DuPont, had an excellent presence with Microsoft and Meta. He was the largest player in Northern Virginia. We were probably the second largest player in Northern Virginia. Once we bought DuPont, that made us the dominant player in Northern Virginia, which was the major data center market in the U.S. I mean, at the time, I don't know if it's still true, but it probably is 70% of the world's data went through Northern Virginia, Loudoun County.
Let's stick with this for a minute. And this was with John Lynn from Equinix, was the kind of the topic of the conversation. And we did the podcast at one of the data centers in Ashburn Village. And the week before, I had ridden my birthday. So I did a 68-mile bike ride out to Ashburn, which is really easy. It's flat. So I got to live with the data centers, on my two wheels. But there were 3, 4, 5 hubs where the data centers needed to be because of interconnectiveness, and Ashburn Village and Northern Virginia is and was huge in that business. But then the Abilenes are a totally different model. So talk about those hubs, how relevant they remain or don't remain, and then where we need to put the learning centers, because a lot of the front page news is about people who don't want those learning centers in their backyard. But I think it's about the learning centers, not about the traditional stuff. So help me unpack all that.
Yeah, so the hubs are, Northern Virginia is the major hub. Dallas, Richardson area is another hub. Chicago suburbs, another important hub. Silicon Valley, another Santa Clara County, another important hub. So I'd say secondary hubs today, maybe Hillsboro, Portland, Oregon, outside of Phoenix, Chandler area. But there are more and more secondary. Atlanta has become an important hub. And
global. So there's hubs everywhere. Again, this is where the interconnectedness is happening. It's all over the world.
Frankfurt's a major hub. Singapore, outside of Paris.
It's funny. One of the comments on the Ezra Klein podcast that I listened to yesterday was, well, why don't they put this in their backyards? Why doesn't Meta put the data center in their backyard? And they said, well, they never put one in Silicon Valley. But there are the last generation of these data centers, that is a hub, actually. So that was a misrepresentation. It's not a place for the learning centers, but it is a place for the last generation of cloud data centers.
Yeah, no, as I said, the learning centers, which have a tremendous power requirement because the compute needs, have to go where there's power or energy to generate power. So that's why you find them in West Texas, you find them in Louisiana, you find them in North Dakota. Silicon Valley's been out of power forever. Santa Clara Power has no power. And actually, Dominion doesn't have any power now. So Virginia is not in a position right now to support additional data center growth. It's slowly coming on, but it's in Virginia. It's sometimes it's generation related, sometimes it's transmission grid related. So a lot of the data center developers and hyperscalers are now going to what we call behind the grid, which is what I mentioned early on, and that's where you put the generation right by the data center. You generate the power at the site.
Generated by the data center itself, or generated by the power company that manages it, but manages it on the site of the data center?
No, it would be managed by either the data center company or an independent power company.
Okay, and what about 3 Mile Island? Wasn't that bought or acquired, or isn't that going to be used by Microsoft? Am I messing up that?
No, that's right. Microsoft entered into a power purchase agreement. I think it's a 15-year deal. It's going to be restarted. It's part of Constellation, which is a large energy company. I think it's the largest, and I think that's a great success story. That I mean, and I also think, and we can talk about this if you want, but I think nuclear is the answer to this energy crisis, if you will. I think I can talk forever about why I think the NIMBYism is a huge mistake, but you can't let the Chinese take the lead on AI. And the country needs a national policy on the development of data centers and the support of AI. And granted, energy and climate are major issues. And I think you're seeing it now with the development of nuclear power. And I think that the urge to develop nuclear power in the country is a function of the need for power for these AI applications.
Okay, I want to talk about the war and the race. So I want to talk about the arms race in a second. Let's just finish up with the old world and your having left digital. Is there any other information to know about what the business was back then 4 years ago before we now turn all of our attention to today?
I think back then it was almost all cloud. The ChatGPT, as you said, it had just come out. The race at that point, in my opinion, was to have as much connectivity as possible to your hyperscaler customers, and you would do that by acquiring companies in other markets around the world. And many of these markets lagged the U.S. in terms of growth. You could see that. So, for example, digital, we bought the largest player in Latin America, Senti. We bought the largest player in South Africa, Terrico, and we saw the growth that was coming. It was going to be huge, and it turned out to be huge. It actually turned out to be bigger than what we underwrote.
And the growth that you saw that was huge was still within the old paradigm, or you saw the new paradigm, but it sounds like...
It was the old paradigm.
Okay, cool. Because the old paradigm could grow forever, which made total sense. I mean, trees don't grow to the sky, but the need for that was going to continue on a maybe geometric basis, and now we're in algorithms, if that's a good way to put it. But that was the business that you left. So let's
that was the business I left.
Okay, cool. Then the revolution happened and the arms race began. And you used some important words here because you talked about we have to beat China, and we have multiple arms race going on, I believe. Arms races between 3, 4, 5, 6 different companies that want to have a lasting AI platform. And arms race number 2 is between the U.S. and China. So talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, so I think the U.S., China, and there are other countries that really care a great deal about developing their own AI capabilities, and they want to support domestic companies if they can. But relative to the U.S. and China, and I guess I think about something that was in the news in the last week where one of Anthropic's applications escaped onto the internet and attacked enterprise software. Now, think about what happens if China has an AI application that doesn't escape, but is allowed to lie quietly in wait and is used to attack software that would otherwise be used to support Patriot missiles, to provide for the defense of missiles that are coming at the U.S., whether from North Korea, Russia, China, or even Cuba, right? Or drones. So if China can create software that can neutralize our software capabilities to defend ourselves, it's game over, right? And you don't want that to happen. And that's the arms race today, in my opinion.
So the arms race, let's try to restate this and think about this a little bit. So there's arms race between 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 companies to be a dominant U.S. player or one that will last.
It's a competitive situation. They want to sell their product to enterprise customers to make them more efficient, more effective.
Yeah, that's true, but I think they also want to get to AGI first, and the race to get to AGI might be the comment that you're making that if China gets to AGI before we get to AGI, even a week before, maybe they push the AGI button and we're all toast.
Yeah, there's that too. So there's national defense, and then there's the commercial implications.
So the race has to happen. And will we survive the race? Because we have to build a lot of these data centers. So this is the national discussion, right? Which is discussion of hey, I don't want this in my backyard. You think NIMBYism is crazy. I kind of do, but I don't know what this is. And what drives this particular NIMBYism is I'm scared to heck of this thing. I'm scared it's going to take my jobs away. So there's an emotional thing behind the way people are reacting to this against something that could be evil. It could be wonderful, but they have no idea. There's an energy question about this. There's a what kind of neighbor will it be? Does it make noise? Is it safe? There's a water question. There's 15 layers of insecurity around this, more than there was with an Amazon distribution center 10 years ago, which was the thing we might worry about. How many more of these humongous data centers need to be built for the learning models so that the race works? And does it have to be a race? Those are multiple questions.
Well, I think it has to be a race. You can't tell the Chinese not to play. So there's a race. In terms of water, that's a specious argument, in my opinion. These are closed loop systems. They don't bring water in from ditches or wells to keep these data centers cool. It's true today that the cooling is a different technology than for most of my time in digital. Today it's called liquid to the chip. It's glycol. Let's think about it as like refrigeration. That's being directed to these chips that are processors that run at a very high heat rate. But unless there's a leak, you don't really use any more water. And if there's a leak, you've got a problem because electricity and fluids don't match particularly well.
No, you
don't want leaks. No. So you don't sprinkle these processors with water, is what I'm saying.
Right.
So liquid, I think the water, there's no water inside the data centers except what's circulating in a closed loop system. The hyperscalers are incredibly focused on carbon neutrality. They have their carbon neutrality goals. Thus, the developers are equally focused because they know it's important for their customers. And we can argue about gas, but I think gas is a reasonably clean source of energy. I also think that gas-fired generation is a bridge to nuclear. Now I mentioned that I was chairman of VERN, the European Data Center company that's focused on the Nordics. The Nordics is an incredibly high demand area for data centers today for a couple of reasons, but it's clean power. It's renewable energy. It's hydro and geothermal is a source of power up there. So the hyperscalers love the Nordics for that reason.
And if the hyperscalers are these learning centers and the latency is not an issue, we don't care where they are. So it could be in Abilene sucking gas, or it could be in the Nordics where it's a little bit cooler and they have better renewables. We don't care, except maybe in the war. In the war, we want them sitting here, although maybe we have allies. I don't know if we have allies anymore, but that's a political question. And also I've heard that maybe Elon wants to put these in space. Can the learning centers be in space?
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't know how much compute you can put in space.
Because latency doesn't matter.
I don't put anything. I don't underestimate Elon's ability to get just about anything done. That what he's accomplished, I think, since he's formed his businesses in these fairly disparate businesses is amazing.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. We're talking today because I'm on Skylink here in the country. I couldn't do this otherwise.
And you said your next appointment is with your Tesla dealership.
Okay, so space is a possibility, but so these data centers are going to be built. These humongous learning centers are going to be built all over the world. Nordics is a place for this, as are the others. NIMBYism's an issue.
Subject to geopolitical constraints.
Yes. And
I would think that the U.S. would want most of these based in the U.S. for policy reasons, for security reasons.
I'll play a political point here with you, which is it used to be that we had bulletproof allies and that the relationships between countries allowed us to count on, okay, it could be there, it could be here, it doesn't matter. Now it has to be here. But if I'm putting in Abilene, I'm just thinking I'm something that runs hot. If I had the choice, I want it to be somewhere cool, not somewhere super hot where I'm blowing gas at the thing.
Well, they're in North Dakota and Wyoming too, but you need it in energy. That's why Meta's in Louisiana.
Right. And okay, so let's go back. So let's also think about this. When the learning models happen and the war is over, because you talked about the leases in these, say in Abilene, and they're 20-year leases, they're with credit tenants, you're safe, but there's been crashes before. What's the obsolescence factor for a data center of the size and scale that's being built in Abilene, or all four of them? What does obsolescence mean? What does it mean in 20 years? Talk about that, both an obsolescence of what's inside the data center as well as the data center itself and how it performs.
So first of all, I think there may be a false premise in your question.
Okay.
When the war is over,
the
what
war
makes you
will be
think
forever.
What makes you think the war will ever be over?
Well, we won't be over.
It's a political question, I suppose, but I don't think it. I think that we're going to be competing against the Chinese for a long time in this area, and I don't think that there's ever going to be. I think there'll be constant movement, but I don't think if the war is over.
That's a scary thing. We don't want the war.
That could be a problem.
Okay, so let's go back to a metaphor then. So the war is a good metaphor. The Cold War is a good metaphor, and nuclear bombs and mutually assured destruction is yet another good metaphor for what you just described. So we'll always move forward because technology always wins in terms of innovation. So we're always in this place with these or other kinds of data centers having to drive this level of competition.
I think so. And I also think for this to work from the U.S. perspective, I said it before, we need a national policy.
Yeah. Okay. So I had a fight with my best friend from college a couple weeks ago. And so what I said to him was what the point that we're at in this conversation right now is I said to him, I think it's what we get to talk about. I said, I think that the job of priests, rabbis, educators, professors, government officials, and therapists over the next 15 years is to help us cope with this thing that's going to change our world forever. And he said, you're an idealist, game's over, we've lost. Silly conversation. He yelled at me. It was weird. But what you're describing is that government, I'm bringing in psychologists because I think they matter too, but all of these folks have to get together and say, okay, what's our policy? Your policy is against the war, is to the war, but there's also policies towards what do we do about employment and all the ripples that this will have societally.
I think employment's important. I think that, but just like any inflection point in the economy over time, when you have basically capital substituting for labor, it's happened ever since we had farmers and we began to move jobs into the cities to make Ford Model Ts. The labor skills needed to do that are different than the labor skills you need to plow a field, initially with horses, then with tractors. So I think you need to recognize that some jobs are going to be replaced by AI, but additional jobs will be generated. And I think that basically showed up in some recent data that showed that employment is increasing. And I think I think the role of government is to help individuals transition in this changing world. And to some extent, that's a safety net. To some extent, that's training for the new jobs.
Mm-hmm. So safety net and training, I agree with you wholeheartedly about this. One thing I think about, and I think about it with the NAFTA thing that happened 20 years ago, whenever that was, is that from a macro standpoint, that's easy to talk about and you can accomplish that. From the micro standpoint of the individuals who become displaced and have to retrain, and maybe they're 56 and they don't want to retrain and they can't retrain, then that's anger and upset because it's not going to work, right? So the macro level, yeah, of course. Micro level, lots of pain in a transition that's really quick with government and philosophy and the rest of it that can't really catch up very well. I fear that.
One of the areas today where salaries or compensation has had the most rapid increase year over year is construction.
Mm-hmm.
And why? Because we're building all these darn data centers everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Master electricians out in Abilene, they're making hundreds of $1,000s a year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think, that's an opportunity. Okay, usually it's young people who go to trade school, but, if you're in your 50s and you've got another 10 years, maybe go to trade school for a year and learn that skill.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that wholeheartedly. There's a lot to unpack there because when I listened to too many podcasts, but one of the ones last week was about why the building trades, why how immigration is attacking the building trades, particularly for single-family housing. And so for the more technical skill sets that are needed to build the data centers, that works. In housing, we've had a lack of workers, many of whom are immigrants who are hammering nails on building single-family homes. So immigration policy comes into this particular one in a painful way. But I agree with trade school, and also anything with your hands, your mind, and your relationships will not be taken over by AI, I think.
Well, and let's talk about single-family housing, because it's relevant to what I think is the future of data center construction, and that is it's going to be centralized. There's not enough labor in the country to support these massive sites in these far-flung locations. The most efficient way is to create a factory and build as much of this as you can and bring it in containers. And by the way, I think you should do the same thing with houses. I would do as much as you can in a factory.
Last podcast on Leading Voices was about a group that's building manufactured housing for ADUs. That was good timing on that comment. I totally agree.
Okay.
Matters a lot. But so kind of let's now think, we're going to have to wrap up.
I'll tell you, and just I'll get a plug. I mentioned firms I'm an advisor with. I forgot Armada. I'm an advisor to a company in San Francisco called Armada, which started out making what I call small form compute support for unmanned warfare. So basically, they bring these units into battle zones like the Ukraine, and they provide the compute support for air, land, and sea drones. And if you think about the amount of data that's required to cause these things to work effectively, it's huge. Their partner, by the way, is Starlink, the firm you're using today on this call. They've expanded their business line, and now they've expanded the form factor, and they're bringing in these things in 10 megawatt increments that brought Microsoft in as strategic. And so they're assembling their data centers off-site and bringing them in containers. And Crusoe, the company that I'm on the board of, has a product called Crusoe Cloud, and they're doing the same thing at a factory in Reno, where they're vertically integrating the data center construction. And Switch, which is a data center company in Vegas, is doing the same thing. They've got a product called Evo. So that is the trend to
let's go
centralize the assembly of these data centers.
So centralizing assembly, but these are small data centers. These are portable data centers. They could be on a container-sized data centers. Is that
containers? Yeah, and the servers are inside these containers. They show up, just kind of plug and play.
So you can have a data center. Not in your backyard, but if you're a property owner in real estate, we care about property owners in real estate, and they can get rid of 5 parking spaces, they might be able to put a container there. Data center.
And you string them together to make them bigger, plug and play.
And is there any, we're bouncing around here, is there any opportunity for solar?
By the way,
on that?
I walked one of these Armada containers at the last data center conference I attended in I think it was in Cannes.
Right. Nice.
And it was, I know. The data center guys are good at finding good venues. The 2 major conferences are in Honolulu and Cannes. We joke about that. But it was just, it's really interesting, sort of the progress that's being made in many different areas of this data center space, including the actual manufacture of the box.
The box, not meaning the server.
The box that contains everything. The box looks like a container.
And could you put 1,000 of these containers together to make Abilene or whatever the number is? Is that
you could? It's more expensive.
You're talking about?
It's more expensive, but I'm seeing at some point it's going to cross over. I think theoretically you could, but sometime I'll send you a picture of what Abilene looks like.
How much of this becomes I understand manufacturing and plants. How much becomes centralized into these humongous properties? Because you just gave the example of in warfare or not warfare, you can decentralize these in smaller chunks. Are the smaller chunks able to be supported in any way by solar panels? That's question 1. And then question 2 is go through what those smaller chunks could look like in the applications for them. Besides war, we've talked a lot about war today, but maybe that's the place it needs to be.
I'll back up. You've got to look at where the constraints are to building these things, or constraints, supply chain constraints. And energy is obviously one of them. There's been a lot of talk about that. But I've been saying for some time that labor is a huge constraint too. You cannot get all the labor required to build these things to all the multi-gigawatt sites that exist in this country. And that's why you need to build these things in a more centralized location and ship as much as you can into that site. I don't think solar today is practical to power these data centers. Wind is, though. If you go north of Abilene to a town called Amarillo, it's actually big. It's a bigger town than Abilene. I don't know if you know your West Texas geography, Matt.
I don't know where it is, but Amarillo by Morning was the theme song of my wedding.
Okay.
It was the first dance was Amarillo by Morning.
All right. Well, a few months back, I toured another Crusoe data center site that's in Amarillo, and there are these wind farms all over the place, and they power along this data center with wind. It's a Google's the customer there, and it feels like a wind tunnel when you walk into this data center. And apparently there's certain times during the day when they actually have to pull the guys off the scaffolding because there's too much wind. But wind works in certain parts of the country, and this is clearly one of those parts.
And when you just said this in Abilene, is it fully powering by wind, or is wind assisting and making less?
Wind is not in Abilene; it's in Amarillo.
Okay, that's what I meant. But is wind fully powering that?
No. There's grid power too. There's gas.
Yeah, but what I've read is that
heavy percentage of wind there.
Good. Everything counts, right? Okay, go back to these containers and go back to just play with the Ukraine for a minute, because I'm curious about it. Gosh, I'm going to mash up too many things. And then how much of what is in Abilene is the space for data center, and how much is Crusoe putting compute? How much of Crusoe's thing itself is the compute, meaning they're putting the boxes inside the data center that they're then selling the compute versus selling the space and power?
Crusoe has two business lines, two primary business lines. One is I call a space and power business like digital, except they're building on a much bigger scale than digital.
Right.
The second is what I'd call a GPU as a service business, like a CoreWeave. So they own the processors, and it's a more vertically integrated offering than what a digital or Equinix provides. And they also have managed services associated with their GPU as a service. So they sell labor as well. So the answer to your question is both.
Okay, so
both in the case of a Crusoe, I would say Crusoe is unique. I don't know of anyone else that does that.
Okay, so and we're touching the surface on multiple topics here. We've done a pretty good job to get around, to put the data points around the circle. But help me think, what are we missing in the conversation? We've not talked about the concentration of capital, and is there a banking stress and a risk of that in here? Let's play that one for a few minutes. What are the crash opportunities? What are the things in here that won't work, or are only going to work for a short period of time?
Well, we haven't, since I've left digital, the private players have grown at a tremendous rate. So digital had, I would dare say, number one market share when I left at 22. I don't think that's the case today, and I'm really certain it's not. I think the private companies have outstripped the public companies. There's a couple reasons for that. One is the private companies can work with more leverage. That the public companies are subject to the rules laid out by the REIT mafia because they're organized as REITs, and because they have investment grade debt, they're subject to the rules of the rating agencies too. So, some of these private companies have massive leverage. Digital is working at 5 times debt to EBITDA. I dare say the private companies are two times that, maybe 2.5 times that. 10x, 10 times debt to EBITDA, 12 times debt to EBITDA. Secondly, the private companies are organized as C Corps, and when they come public, I think they're going to come out as C Corps. They're not going to be REITs. So there's not going to be a requirement to pay out 90% of your taxable income as REITs. They can retain capital to continue to support the growth. Third, the incumbents, if you will, the incumbent public companies do have an obsolescence issue in their data centers. They're trying to retrofit them, and I think to some extent they've been successful. But it's still, it's a challenge. And the newer players obviously, have a fresh canvas that they can paint on. So that's an advantage. Fourthly, I think, I see this at Crusoe because I'm fortunate enough to be on that board. They have it's an incredibly capable board. There were 2 other independents joined that when I did that have tremendous backgrounds. That they haven't been, their identities haven't been published yet, but you'll see when that comes out. Plus, you have the private equity guys that put the money in initially that are on the board. This is an incredibly good board. The public companies it's very hard to change over a public board. There's a lot of inertia there.
Mm-hmm.
And people that would have come on that board 10 or 15 years ago arguably don't have the right skills and background to provide guidance to the management team today, given what's happened in the last 10 to 15 years. We've been talking about that for the last hour and a quarter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of one backdrop. From a capital standpoint, there's only so much bank capital to support this growth. So as a result, the newer players in particular have entered the project bond market. They're targeting the fixed income world, the PIMCOs of the world, if you will, to fund their requirements. And they're funding it at a much higher leverage ratio, though, as I said before, than you would have, than the public guys can do because of their balance sheet constraints.
Mm-hmm.
So, you're seeing 95% loan to cost financing with rated public bonds on these projects.
The last crash I saw, everything was rated pretty well. There was leverage at that level.
No, that's right. Now, the counterparty risk, though, they're tripling that 15, 20-year leases with the likes of a Microsoft. So the question is, do you think Microsoft's going to file and not be able to honor its lease obligations? I'm willing to make that bet that they won't.
So really interesting article in the paper the other day about Oracle. So you said Microsoft, I'll believe that one. Oracle's really leveraged up to the hilt to put all of its bets into this one with Larry Ellison. And so maybe there is risk there because we're putting all our chips on the table.
But I put Larry Ellison and Elon Musk in the same category. I think you'd go broke betting against them as individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Larry Ellison net worth is tied up in Oracle. He's going to make sure that's solid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think so. We shall see. I mean, you question when there's a secular, deep, fundamental change in the world. So go through any other kind of future things we want to think about, because I want to end this with the philosopher hat back on.
I think we've covered it. I mean, it's balance sheets. There's corporate. Do you want to be C Corp or REIT? I think the C Corps have an advantage. It's talent, war for talent. That is one interesting point, though. Given the NIMBYism, I think the skill sets required for CEOs today are different than they were 5 years ago. Even you have to be able to deal with these the federal, state, and community issues around the world. You have to be able to get out in front of people and connect with large groups of people and connect with policymakers, governmental leaders as well to make your point. And the data center guys have.
And is there? So you just raised the topic I actually did want to land on in the conversation, and one of the prefaces is that housing, particularly multifamily, single-family rental, which we know have become hot buttons in culture for a lot of reasons. And it's because the scarcity of housing and cost has gone wild because of scarcity, I believe. But the industry's been attacked, and the industry is well organized, but they're not well organized in terms of how they have a public face. So the public face is a challenge. And one of the other things I wondered about going to bed last night is the data center industry and therefore the AI industry, because they're right next to each other. But how do they deal with the public face of this to explain this stuff that's really complicated?
I don't think first of all, it's being done on an individual company basis today. I don't think they've come together as an association, as a group.
Okay.
And I think that the effectiveness varies wildly from company to company.
And you told the story, so I think storytelling really matters here, part of what we're doing here, but this won't hit a popular audience because we're all over the place on the story. But I wonder for this industry, how the storytelling does happen. You talked about it from the perspective of NIMBYism, but the NIMBY thing is local, but federal government and even world government and the power battle between U.S. and China, that's where this also needs to sit. So you have to be able to toggle back and forth between convincing the people in a Midwestern state that they can have a big data center there, as well as being able to think about this from a national policy standpoint.
Yeah, fundamentally, these firms have to make a significant investment in public affairs talent.
100%. Last question on Leading Voices is always advice to a young person entering into the real estate business.
Don't lock into any one path. Be flexible. Be willing to take risk.
That's it. That's
it.
Okay.
Take a risk on your career as you would on any capital investment.
Uh-huh.
But also, if it's not working out after 12 or 18 months, don't stay too long. Move on to the next thing.
Pivot. It's interesting to think about your career, which we talked about, early on in the episode, because you took a risk on a sector that no one had ever heard of and that was not really part of the real estate world. You were a real estate guy, and it was this thing called data centers. And you've been along for a long ride.
Matt, when I went to college, I majored in Greek and Latin, classics.
Mm-hmm.
Not the least bit of a technical background. You just have to be open to trying new things your entire life. Life has to be a constant learning exercise.
I love it. You get to do that. So you're front row seat to that. So Bill, thank you very much. This has been a great conversation.
My pleasure. Good to be with you again, Matt. And enjoy the rest of your summer.
You too. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. Please remember, if you're enjoying Leading Voices, to share an episode with a friend or get them to subscribe. If they're podcast wary and not sure how to find and subscribe on their phone, go ahead and take their phone in your hand and subscribe for them. And add another few of your favorite podcasts to their list to get them started. They'll thank you for it. You can also find episodes of the show on our website, which you can find at crgpartners.com/leadingvoices. And if you have comments or discussion about this episode or Leading Voices in general, or if you're seeking help in real estate human capital solutions, recruiting or consulting especially, please contact me at mslepin@crgpartners.com. Thanks for being a listener to Leading Voices.